Hi, I'm Fed and I'm learning to make stuff by pouring tons of videos through my eye holes and into my brain. Today I'm going to show you how I made this improved version of my Mandalorian bust. This is Concrete Mandalorian Bust 2.0. Hi, I'm Fed. Ouch. I'm not obsessed with the Mandalorian, you're obsessed. And don't tell me this is the way that obsessed people act. Just because I've spent hundreds of dollars and weeks of my life to build a handful of concrete figurines does not mean I'm obsessed. It just means that sometimes little imperfections bother me and I can't stop trying to fix them. It's called iteration, obsessive iteration. Oh, you know what? That time I heard it. Mandalorian Bust 1.0 was great, but it had problems. The bust itself had visible layers which I wanted to fix this time around. And while I thought the first pedestal I designed was great, I really enjoyed the process of designing it, coming up with the 3D printed soft mold idea, it too had problems. Once I had made a few of them, I realized that it didn't really look like a classic pedestal, plus it had those layer lines that I didn't like. So I started over. First stop was the internet to figure out what style of pedestal I wanted. I liked the look of Doric columns because they weren't needlessly ornate and would be simpler to model and mold. Plus, Mando isn't into fancy stuff. He's more of a functional reform kind of bounty hunter. After looking at a bunch of Doric columns, I designed my own 3D printing friendly version in Fusion 360. It came in two parts with an alignment peg. I printed the two parts, glued them together, and then filled in all the layer lines with wood putty and gray primer. I did the same for the bust itself. This was all done off camera, but I go into more detail later about how I finished version 2.5 of the pedestal. By the way, the marks and scratches were left there on purpose because I wanted the pieces to have a bit of a rough look. So I had new models, and now I had to make new silicone molds. First step was building the mold boxes. In case you're new to silicone block molds, you mount your model on a flat surface, build a box around it, and fill the box with silicone. This time I used sticky wax instead of hot glue to attach the models to their foam core bases. I learned that technique from Robert Tallone's mold making channel. When I used hot glue, it damaged my models. Sticky wax is a lot gentler and easier to work with. Something that's easy to forget when you're making a block mold is that the top of the model actually becomes the bottom of the mold when it's complete. And you have to be careful not to trap any air in the mold because it will ruin the castings you make. That happened to me with version 1.0 of the Mandalorian bust. Air got trapped under the arm stumps and I wanted to avoid that this time around. So I added what they call in the mold making biz air vents. You can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes. They're channels that let air escape from the mold. I knew that the pedestal's corners would trap air, so I added a piece of armature wire at one of the corners. After the silicone sets and I remove the wire, it will leave a channel for air to escape. I probably didn't need such a thick wire, but I was afraid that concrete wouldn't flow into a narrower air vent. What I didn't know is how frickin' hard it can be to add air vents. All the silicone mold videos make it look so easy. I felt like an Imperial attack droid trying to play with a Rancor. It wasn't working. I had decided to use wax wire to let air escape from Mando's armpits, but it was really hard to align them and get them to stick. And why did I think that it would be easier to balance the bust on its head and then balance wax sticks on Mando's arm stumps?
I don't know.
Finally, I had the models mounted with their air vents in place. Then I built the mold boxes around them. The boxes are made out of foam core and glued in place and sealed with hot glue. Now, look at the size of the pedestal mold box. That's going to require a ton of silicone. I should have thought about that when I was building the box, but I didn't. I could have given the box rounded sides, but because I'm not the sharpest bulb in the shed, I didn't. However, I did remember a technique used by mold makers to use less silicone. It involves cutting up old silicone molds and using the silicone chunks as filler inside of new molds. It's a great way to recycle old silicone and use less new silicone at the same time. With all my silicone chunks ready, I figured out how much silicone I needed by volume. First, I multiplied the height, width, and length in millimeters of each mold box to get a cubed millimeter volume. Then I divided cubed millimeters by 1,000 to get milliliters. Math is awesome. I applied some mold release and mixed up a batch of silicone for the bust mold first. You know what's terrifying? Opening up $300 worth of silicone. This is 20 pounds worth of silicone. What if I mess it up? What if I break it? Can you break silicone? I use the same silicone I've used for my other molds, Smooth On Mold Star 15. It has a working time of 50 minutes, so I didn't have to rush. Next, I worked on the mold for the pedestal. This required pouring in a layer of liquid silicone, then carefully adding in silicone chunks, then another layer of liquid silicone, and so on until the mold was filled. The important thing to remember about this technique is to not let the silicone chunks touch the model. Even though Moldstar 15 cures in 4 hours, I waited until the next day to demold the models. This is when it really hit me how dumb I had been when making the pedestal mold. So much wasted silicone. It was big and heavy and unwieldy. I decided to cut off the corners, making the mold a hexagon. Cutting the pedestal model out of the mold was more difficult for me than it was for Mando to get back those Razor Crest parts the Jawas stole.
You understand this?
But seriously, this was really hard to demold. It was painstaking and tiring work. My hands became exhausted and I had to take frequent breaks. Demolding the bust model was a lot simpler, especially because I had practice from the last time. Soon after demolding, I mixed some fresh concrete and poured it into the molds. Those blocks around the bust mold are there to ensure the rubber bands provide even pressure on the sides. The pedestal mold doesn't need them because the hexagonal shape evenly distributes the rubber band's pressure. The first castings look pretty good. I was especially happy to see that the air vents worked as intended. They allowed air to escape. You can see in the pedestal mold how the concrete traveled up the air vent. The concrete was still a little wet, but I did some initial finishing of the pieces. Concrete is easier to work with when it's damp. The pieces weren't perfect. There are quite a few little bubbles, but not bad for the first attempt. With my first castings done, I got crazy and did a bunch more, seeing if I could reduce or eliminate these tiny bubbles. Some concrete casting videos recommended spraying the molds with soapy water as it's supposed to help the bubbles escape. I also left the concrete mix bucket on my DIY vibration table for a couple of minutes and tapped the sides of the molds to see if I could release all the bubbles. The second set of castings had fewer bubbles, but they weren't bubble-free. And I learned that I have to be careful when removing the pedestal casting from the mold, because otherwise you can snap off a corner as easily as IG-11 beats up stormtroopers. The third castings I made look good, but this time I broke Mando's backpack as well as the corner off the pedestal. Oh, damn it. This is when I decided to make another cut in the pedestal mold so that I could more easily remove the castings. Attempt number 4. This time I left the castings in their molds for 3 or 4 days to let them dry out more. I figured they would be stronger and less likely to break that way. Off topic, and I don't mean to brag, but this is the most beautiful shot of my shoulder I've ever taken. The extra cut on the pedestal mold allowed me to remove the casting much more easily. I must not have been careful removing bubbles, however, because there are quite a few voids on these castings. Great. Not my best work, but also not my worst. For the 5th castings, I used my upgraded vibration table. Oh yeah, it now had a grippy silicone top that vibrated the bantha poop out of the concrete. Again, not perfect, but the extra debubbling of the concrete paid off. I experimented with using my Wen sander to speed up cleaning the castings with pretty good results. It was tricky sometimes holding the pieces in place, and there was a lot of concrete dust flying around. I make a lot of mistakes, but I'm not totally dumb. You can't see in these shots, but I'm wearing a mask. You don't want to breathe in concrete dust. It's really nasty stuff. To drill the mounting holes in the bust and pedestals, I used a new thin masonry bit I found on Amazon. The last bit I used was a little too thick for the bust. This new one worked really well. Similar to last time, I used a piece of metal and construction glue to join the busts and pedestals. I don't know if this was necessary, but I put little crimps in the wire pieces. My thought was that they would help grab onto the construction glue once it dried. As I worked along my concrete Mandalorian bust assembly line, I did some additional cleanup of the pieces. Some had a lot of voids, some less, a couple of the pedestals had broken corners. I decided to lean into the imperfections and make them look like part of the design. So I gouged out some of the voids, sharpened some edges, and smoothed out others. I even grew to appreciate the pedestals with broken corners. I think it made them look more badass. At this point, I had 6 version 2.0 concrete Mandalorian busts that I was really happy with. Sure, they weren't perfect, but they were arguably better than my version 1.0 busts, and they were very satisfying to make. I love the new pedestal. I wanted something more refined and more old world looking than my first design, and that's what I achieved. I should have been happy, right? I should have quit while I was ahead. But, and you knew there was a but, the little bubbles on the pedestal really bothered me. I could not get rid of them. So I iterated one last time and attempted a new pedestal model and mold. I thought, hey Fed, what if the pedestal mold was in 2 pieces? You could then avoid the need for an air vent and there wouldn't be any areas that would trap air. So of course I did a bunch more iterating. I modeled a new pedestal in Fusion 360 in 2 parts. This version didn't have an alignment peg. I then printed the parts. I liberally applied glazing putty to fill in the layer lines. I sanded down the puttied parts. I sprayed primer over them. I sanded them down again. Oh, and I used these awesome sanding sticks to get into crevices. Then I built mold boxes for the parts and filled them with silicone. I had to mix the silicone in my super messy home office because it was too cold in my unheated workshop. One of my mold boxes sprung a leak, but I stopped it with a piece of paper towel and a hairdryer. Then I demolded the 2 parts. Once I had my molds, I filled them with concrete, let it cure, and demolded the castings. Removing the upper pedestal casting was tricky, but I finally got it out. Next, I finished the parts, including another Mando bust on the Wen sander. Maybe I wasn't patient, but it didn't go well. I didn't sand the parts perfectly square, and I almost destroyed the top pedestal part when it got caught in the sander. Finally, I drilled holes in the parts and glued them together. Since the pedestal was in 2 parts, I had to drill extra holes and carefully align all the pieces. So was it worth it? Well, let's see. The molds were easier to make and resulted in castings that had fewer bubbles and no seams. On the other hand, finishing the pieces took a lot more work. I had to do more sanding and I had to drill more holes. Plus, I wasn't able to eliminate the gap between the top and bottom pedestal pieces. And that's how I made Concrete Mandalorian Bust 2.0. I go into a lot more detail about mold making in the first video, so you might want to check that one out. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye!